Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the second of our Spring Forward webinars brought to you by Engineering Australia. I'm Andrew Grill, the Actionable Futurist here in London, and I'm joined today by two fabulous guests. Coming from Sydney is Richard Rechner, who is also a fellow South Australian. He leads the GHD Advisory business globally and has extensive experience in project engineering, strategic planning, and capital transactions, with more than 30 years' experience in market sectors such as power generation, transmission and distribution, oil and gas, property, water, rail, road, defence, air and seaports, manufacturing, mining and heavy industry in Australasia, USA, Europe and the Middle East. He's also held senior leadership roles in both the public and private sector within Australian and Vanuatu government organisations, commercial and strategy leadership within AGL, and in regional and global roles at GHD. He's an active mentor, a fellow of Engineers Australia, a fellow of the Australian Institute of Project Management, and a fellow of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks, Andrew. Great to be here.
Joining us from London is Matthew East, who leads GHD's Advisory, Logistic and Infrastructure Policy team for the UK, Europe and Middle East. He's been the lead for logistics, operation, commercial, technical, risk and environmental elements for private and public sector clients. And his previous engagements include providing a detailed understanding of hinterland connectivity. He developed strategies for water transport services and enhancement of port facilities. Recently, he was involved with the Freight Resilience Project for the UK Department of Transport. Welcome, Matthew.
Thanks, Andrew. Great to be here as well.
So, Richard, just turning to you firstly, also thank you for being online from Sydney late on a Thursday afternoon. You run GHD Advisory. You might want to tell us a bit more about the advisory role and how the Australian business has evolved.
Yeah, well, thanks, Andrew. I might start out a little bit with the history of the GHD business, because as part of that diversification journey is probably quite important. So, GHD is over 90 years old, having been founded in 1928 in Melbourne. And that was very much, as many of you might know, with a focus on water and sanitation. And really worked through the provision of those services during the Depression, leading through into the 1940s, when the first diversification in supporting defence industry for World War II really took off. And it probably stayed to that knitting until there's some great expansion into engineering in other markets during the 1950s. Very much focusing then on transportation, manufacturing, energy, mining, and dams. And then in the 70s, got involved in a lot more of response to risk and incidents, starting out with things like the recovery from Cyclone Tracy. And it's also in the 70s when we first started growing a global footprint. And our first piece there was a joint venture into engineering consulting in Malaysia. So that was our first international play. We diversified in the 90s and started bringing in other services outside of engineering design with things like architecture, environmental consulting, and an advent into business consulting. And it was in the 90s that I first joined GHD. In the 2000s, it was really a piece of global involvement in expansion, growing into places like the Middle East, New Zealand, Southeast Asia, UK, USA, Canada, and Chile. And our work really pushed much more into sustainability, into areas of threat like desalination to meet the growing need for our cities with water, and the Millennium Drought that took place in Australia. And on the back of that, that diversification request really came from our clients and the emerging market change. And that led to us leading up to 2016, starting GHD Advisory. And that was really on the basis of clients saying, well, you're doing some of this engineering design work, you're doing the environmental and the planning in these areas, you're helping deliver assets, you've morphed into sustaining those assets through asset management. But there's a much bigger piece there in investing in infrastructure, in the economics of infrastructure, into risk, assurance, regulation, other areas. So we had a few individuals that were doing some of this work, and I was one of those, doing this alongside other leadership tasks and roles and engineering functions. So we brought a small group together from within the existing business, formed GHD Advisory, initially in Australia in year one, 2016, stretched ourselves across the Tasman to New Zealand in the second year, and then launched ourselves into UK, Middle East, and North America in our third year. And so, we've grown and now moved into Southeast Asia. October last year, during the middle of the pandemic, we opened an advisory office in Singapore, and now have people in Singapore and the Philippines in Southeast Asia to complement the other countries I mentioned. We've continued growing in the UK. We merged with a strategic consulting company called Movement Strategies in 2020. They were very much leading crowd dynamics modeling, and that's been a very useful addition in response to needs, whether it's returning crowds to Wimbledon and soccer matches, whether it's supporting a UK health, thinking about freight logistics, and taking some of those learnings from the UK across our global network. So that's probably the evolution, Andrew, that took place. And like a lot of our focus, it's been client-led.
It's a great success story, and I come from the consulting world, both inside telcos in Australia and with IBM. GHD, the pure design and engineering folks, and how they also work with you in an advisory role. I'm sure the two complement each other really well.
With that piece of how do we operate with the engineering context, the advisory business is really about supporting our clients across their business value chain rather than particular assets or rather than particular pieces of infrastructure. So it's a lot about the deployment of capital, optimizing investments, both at CapEx and OpEx level, how to preserve value of those assets for a business in changing cycles, sustainability, resilience, liability, etc. What we've found probably is the sweet spot in this process is very much about how we bring that benefit to the client. So it's very much a mix about adjusting the services and the insights brought to clients based upon their challenge. And sometimes that's the challenge about whether they know they have that challenge right now or not, and having those conversations. And so how we're structured is very much that the advisory piece is always there in our commissions, but we reach out to the 10,000 or so technical engineers, if I call it that piece, to bring the particular expertise across the market, the sector, the asset class, etc., to bear. So if the challenge, as we've seen, is on the risk management of, say, in recent years, of tailings dams around the world, then we can bring the risk, the economics, and the business skills alongside our world-class tailings management and dams teams to solve those problems together. So we found it's really trading on the fact that we have some great technical authority in our core engineering and science-based disciplines, and that very much is an add to what we can bring our clients rather than a distraction. So we don't duplicate any of those services within our business, and it allows us to think about those more strategic market challenges and draw from the core of GHD as needed.
I was going to ask about the skill sets. You've covered part of that.
Yep.
What are the different skill sets maybe across the practice? Have you hired from within, or do you need to recruit externally to get that consulting and engineering balance right?
Well, historically, it's been a bit of both. So, we do have a much broader mix of disciplines within the advisory. So there's people, like myself and Matt here, that have an engineering background and those areas, and that's where we started their careers. But certainly we have people, if we go back to degrees and backgrounds, we've got a lot of people with finance, accounting, business, economics, psychology. I've even found in my own career pathway, I studied anthropology along the journey for effectiveness and how you deliver projects in certain places. But certainly sustainability, we've got a lot of mathematicians, people international relations, marketing, and obviously with a lot of double degrees being the norm, we find a lot of our graduate program people have an engineering commerce or an engineering economics or an engineering international relations and those sorts of things, which brings that broader piece. Now that's the graduates, but with the lateral hires we have for more senior people, we do have a lot of people who've come out of industry as well or out of large consulting houses and see the benefits of joining an organization that has that technical excellence and background behind it. But we've got a lot of people who've been in the infra sector, CEOs, CFOs, strategy, finance, banking. And so it's the amalgam of all those elements brought together, I think, is where you create value. And it's the bringing together the different views and the challenges to solve, what really are wicked problems in the current market. So, our sourcing strategy is broad, and it's really about that diversity of thinking, Andrew.
Oh, I love that. It's my favorite expression. And I really can understand where you're coming from, because I am exactly that. I started as an electronic engineer. I worked for Telstra and Optus. I fell in love with marketing and became a marketer and business development and a CEO. So, and I think what we'll explore a bit later on is how, I've not stayed a pure engineer, but the diversity of thinking, the thinking from first principles to solve problems, I think that's incredibly rich. And I know that people on the webinar today, some are pure engineers, some are thinking about engineers, and those that are engineers that are saying, what else can I do with my career? I wanted to really look at how we change the perception of engineering. Engineering and engineers need to move with the times. So in your career, how have you seen the perception of engineer change as a career? And what can we do to ensure it does evolve with a changing commercial landscape?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think, if I reflect upon both the time since I graduated mid-80s with my engineering degree, my first career was as an army officer. So I was a Dunshire graduate and progressed in that pathway before turning my hand to a consulting life. After about 14 years in the military. What I've seen through the time is very much we've seen through education a greater degree of specialisation, and there's great strengths, but there's challenges that come with that. When I went through university, we really had a choice of, if you want to do engineering, you're either civil, mechanical, electrical, or chemical. And on the campus I went to, we only had 3 of those.
Oh,
And
wow.
so people are very much now, the graduates we're getting are quite specialized in some of those areas. And so I think that's great for great depth and focus. But I guess the challenge is then to think broad, and how we balance that. Now that can be helped, as I mentioned, through what's increasingly popular now, double degrees, and also much greater access and much more streamlined programs from when I started an MBA was, getting some business and broader qualifications throughout your career. And what we're doing now with, we're on a international webinar now, but education is moving much more to online. So it means that I guess gaining challenge and change in your thinking, your experience, whether it's through micro credentials or more formal training, is now possible in that sense. I think at the same time, we've also seen, Andrew, that there's been a lot of government outsourcing programs have run throughout the last 30 years. And so in many ways, we have less informed buyers who rely upon organisations who are contractors, consultants and others to bring innovation into their solutions. And sometimes a challenge in the market is lowest price wins through procurement. And therefore, I think we have a new challenge for the industry and for engineers of, how do I bring best practice thinking? How do I bring the most sustainable solution and demonstrate value in a procurement model that's geared towards lowest price? And so without giving away my IP, if you like, in some of these areas as well, to make a difference. So I think there are challenges there. I think some of those challenges are, we've seen a change in engineering profession over those 30, 40 years. Software was originally replacing the drafters and the tracers from when I started university. They were career paths of their own right. And moving to model-based design, we've allowed, in some ways, reliance upon those tools and Australian standards or British standards to drive a commonality and a safe solution, and not really push the stretch thinking. And that's allowed some commoditization. And while we focused on those changes, we've seen the rise of the legal profession and perhaps the financial skill sets to broaden what they do as well. So we have infrastructure strategy consultants living within large law firms. We have project management and asset management for engineering solutions being driven through the big 4 consulting houses globally. So I think there's a diversification that will continue. But I do think organisations and the profession need to think about how we create value, how we create innovation for clients along the way. So that broader business view, we think back to the great engineers of 100 to 200 years ago. They were very broad in their thinking regarding provision of services, provision of better outcomes, provision of changing the economic, fare of the communities in which they're working. And I think we need to get back to some of that thinking amongst the leadership of our profession. So really long answer, I guess.
And part of it sounds like educating clients, because you're quite right. I mean, I've dealt with a lot of procurement people, and if anyone out there is watching from procurement, love your work. But how do we educate them about going beyond the final figure and designing to a price rather than solving the actual solution? It sounds like your whole approach, both you personally and GHD Advisory, is let's look at the solution, the best solution that fits. You don't want to just copy someone and chase the price down. How do you differentiate yourself when a lot of things are still price-led at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one, because there's always somebody who's prepared to buy a project. And we've seen that perhaps in the UK in the last 12 or 18 months, when a number of major projects or initiatives have been shelved during COVID times, and therefore people want to keep their teams together and keep their businesses ticking. And so it's becoming an increasingly competitive framework there. I think it really comes to demonstrating that benefit realisation. We're seeing on the private sector a lot of organisations now really understanding TOTEX rather than CapEx in that
Oh,
piece.
I haven't heard that expression. I love that. TOTEX.
TOTEX.
For everyone there, what's your definition of TOTEX? I think I know what you mean.
It's the whole of life operating costs for an asset. So you need to think about not just how I can design and build it cheaply, but what those sustainment costs, what those upgrades or changes might be to future-proof over the expected life, over 30, 40, 50 years of that asset casting forward. And I think, in many private sector organizations, CapEx and OpEx have often been held or managed by different parts of leadership teams. And one of the great advents, I think, of ESG thinking and sustainability thinking is bringing more of a whole asset picture to bear. If I go back many years ago when I was working on the Sydney Olympics, we're talking about embedded energy for the first time in projects. And it's progressed now to how you think about your total asset carbon footprint, and how you can optimize those assets from both an operating cost, but also we're now thinking much more about the customer or the end client or the end user of the infrastructure, the building, the train service, or anything else in the customer experience piece. So, taking that whole view there, but it does require early thinking. It does require earlier positioning, and it does require influencing perhaps what the brief might be, what's being asked for. So there's a lot more flexibility to demonstrate new thinking rather than coming back to a very narrow and rigid piece and putting non-conforming offers, as it used to be, into that. So it does require, more interface early, more investment in that thinking time early, and demonstration of that benefit realization for the client overall.
So the influencing part is really interesting. And I suppose when I did my engineering degree, there wasn't a subject on influence and how to run a meeting and how to do business development. Again, back to engineers who look at things from first principles, and just a sort of a two-part question. You're rolling up to a bid without giving away your IP. Are you on your own that you're looking at TOTEX and you're saying the OPEX and CapEx, and by the way, you won't be here in 10 years when we're still running this asset. So you haven't thought about that and it's outside your budget. But are people going, well, we hadn't thought about that, and the fact that you've actually broken it down, we're going to look at your bid more closely because you're actually telling us what we want to hear rather than just what the next 3 years are?
Yeah, I think it depends on the client, depends on the location, the cycle, but there's much more room to move in thinking in that space. But it's a changing environment, and I think what it means is, there's approaches there, Andrew, which are horses for courses in this piece, and matching that. And there are clients you can choose to do that, and there are clients who may not be so interested in that. And it comes back to the budget, the flexibility, but also some of the strategy and the vision. So depending who the minister, who the head of a government department, a local government, a mining client, a transportation client, a water authority, they'll all have different views about what the risks, the opportunities, the use of technology, their own customer experience for their end users and those in those areas. But I think that areas of social media can be fantastic. It can also be quite difficult when people, we've seen a big advent in Australia of people seeking COVID advice through places like TikTok, which may not be the best area. And talking to the head of a large regional hospital the other day, he was trying to convince patients, that immunisation doesn't cause them to become sterile, or vaccines don't cause alopecia, and these areas. And many people are taking medical advice off social apps, which is not right. But I think get the community voice is one area that the expectation of what's wanted, placemaking, livable cities, sustainable cities and communities is far more important now. The voice is there, and certainly, a much younger generation than perhaps I am in have a much more voice and want to be heard and want to understand what's going on. So I think it does lead into a changing environment about a longer term provisioning, and it does mean that rather than the ideal engineering solution being developed, we're leading towards what's the ideal sustainable community solution that needs to be developed. And therefore, I think the teams we work in will increasingly become multidisciplinary, rather than engineers coming up with a solution and someone working out how to finance it separately. I think we've got a much more of a merge of those teams working in unison over the ideation and the development phase of projects.
One thing that we're all faced with is an avalanche of data. We say data here, but you say data there, so we'll interchange it. But with the avalanche of data now available to engineers, how can we make best use of it to drive better business decisions and outcomes?
That's another great question. I think data can be the new gold for infrastructure provision, but I think you have to be able to sift it. It's like anything, there's a lot of, there might be some fool's gold in there as well, but there's a lot mixed up in that ore. And just because you've captured a lot of data doesn't mean to say you've got great insights. Doesn't mean to say from that raw data you can produce a great deal of benefit. You might have just a lot of numbers to crunch and not really know where to go. So I think it is bringing about, we're thinking about that quite differently. We're thinking about the management of the data is one thing, how you produce the insights. So you need to have great data and analytic skills. You also need to have some people to understand what does that mean. Where are the risks? Where are the sweet spots? Where can that convergence really bring some great value rather than a whole lot of noise? And so we're finding there's a great deal of benefit in bringing together multi-generational teams. So to understand, because you can the insights have to be meaningful. They have to hit the balance sheet. They have to reduce risk, protect lives. Look after the community, look after the environment, and those areas. So it's a great way to have both, say, multidisciplinary and multi-generational challenge within teams, and certainly bringing forward the views of both external parties, the clients' parties, etc., into the room. So we're seeing that it really comes back to producing the insight is where the value is, rather than the source of the data. You can capture a lot, but you need to have the right mechanisms to store and sift and get those insights. We're actually seeing that there's a lot of opportunity, and Matt can probably talk about this a bit later on, but COVID has changed supply chains. There's a lot more about local production, local security, and understanding where those pinch points are, where those weaknesses might be in a changing environment. Modeling those can really help some good decision making. We're seeing in new industries, and one of those might be in the future energy. And for instance, we've developed some really great solutions in the hydrogen market to understand the supply chain, understand where some of those cost curves might change over time. When is the right time? What areas do we invest in? Where can you make the biggest incremental improvements? And run some scenarios. So you can actually run not just from an engineering sense, a simulation of a digital twin being an asset, but really use the data to build a digital business twin, a digital regional twin. And we've even done some of those for UK cities, and understanding what are the effects on their economies from tourism, shutdowns, spending habits. How do you stimulate the economy? So I think there's a lot that can be done that we didn't have through the provision of data and modelling skills. And it really comes in the bringing together, again, what we've called techno-economic modelling. So it's the engineering and the project engineering skills, as well as the finance, the economics of the region, the trade, etc., into one area. We've also seen in a lot of industries where there's not natural competitors. So in many cases, in the engineering services provision, water authorities, in many cases, poles and wires for power, they are natural monopolies. There's regulation around their income streams, and they're not competing in the same geography. And we're seeing a number of those are happy to share data and insights to help improve the sector, because it brings a competitive advantage to them all staying in business, rather than other areas where you have a lot of competition, which might be between, say, modes of travel. It's less so in that willingness to share data. And I think how you can also consider the right timing for infrastructure provision versus non-infrastructure solutions, changing the way we behave and work. We've seen a lot of that in the last 18 months as well, of how we travel to work, how we work, and how we can get the best advantage. And I think you can simulate a lot of those areas with data and come up, you may not get the right solution, but you're going to know that things on left or right of arc are less likely, and how you can optimize the best course of action. And as things change, you can rerun those scenarios quite efficiently compared to what might have been far more manual and time-consuming process, only maybe 5 years ago.
I think the sharing of data is so important. Here in the UK, open APIs are a common thing. Years ago, the Mayor of London opened up an API for transport data. So literally all the red buses you see around here in London have GPS on there. That is an open API of where they are. And there are a number of providers that have now, like Citymapper is one of them, where you can actually say, when is my bus due? And it is very, very accurate. And we've seen that with open banking. Governments in Europe have actually regulated that the data is made open. And I'm seeing that happen in Australia as well through regulation. It's just disappointing that it's a government that says you must share data so that you can make better business decisions. Just remind everyone, we don't want to just have this as a broadcast. We'd love to hear your questions. I've already got a few questions come through on WhatsApp, but if you have a burning question, please drop it in the chat and we'll see if we can get to it a bit later on. Both Richard and Matt have got years and years of experience, and the things that we're talking about now are really, really compelling. We touched on it before, where engineering and consulting are colliding. You're a traditional engineering company and you've moved into consulting. The large traditional big four or big six, and I was in one of them at IBM, are also looking at moving into this area. Is there room for both groups, or does an engineering-led approach provide better outcomes? And that's a loaded question, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, strangely, Andrew, I'm probably biased in my view here, but so there's no surprise in that. But I think the real value, as I mentioned earlier, comes from the integration of specializations. It doesn't come from everyone being a broad generalist. So I might just lead in with that piece. So our business in the global advisory business, so we are global. I operate a global P&L, is very much not replicating the deep technical specialists. Now, if I think about the sort of commissions we have in advisory, one day I might need a tailings dam specialist. The next I might need a life safety of a tunnel. The next I might need a port strategist, and someone that really understands the hard engineering of a port. The next we might be talking about, improving the performance of an airline or an integrated freight that has air, sea, and land. And so the skill sets, the engineering, the planning skills, etc., are quite different. So, we focus on the business side of the consulting piece with an infrastructure bent, and we bring in those other areas. So, our model is very much about leveraging and applauding that degree of technical excellence and authority from a core engineering business. I think, if you're a financially based consulting house, you have that deep understanding of tax, of financial management, and you probably have your engineering teams are far more generalists in that sense, and won't cover every area in that sense. So, I think there's horses for courses. When we work up to when working with a client on their business models, for instance, I don't offer tax advice, and we don't offer external legal advice. So we work with others, or we work with those parts of the client organization. And I think will we do that in the future? Don't know. But I think it's really making sure that you can bring that specialization to play. Because once you come back to just giving very general solutions, I think you lose some of that value add to the clients. So is there room for both? Yes. But I think it comes back to making sure that we're all able to offer the best advice, and it's not infrequently that we team with other consultants who have those areas of specialization that we don't have. Now, there's some areas when we can be a one-stop shop across the GHD family of companies. Other times we can't. And I think the real value generation for clients is by recognition of those strengths and weaknesses.
I'd like to look at some practical examples, and I know you've solved challenging business problems. When we were preparing this webinar a few weeks ago, you shared a really interesting story about how some young engineers just 5 years out of uni were responding to the Christchurch earthquake and took ownership of a problem on site. I'd love you to share that story with us.
Yeah, well, that goes back, therefore, about 10 years or so ago from the earthquake in Christchurch. And for those who are not aware, Christchurch was badly damaged by a 7.1 magnitude earthquake. Much of the CBD of the city was destroyed, as were roads, bridges, engineering services, and some suburbs suffered from liquefaction. It produced over 400,000 tonnes of silt in the urban area that hadn't been there before. And there's a lot of subsidence. In some cases, buildings. In other cases, it might have been a whole suburb had subsided. And by that, it might have been up to like a metre in that piece. We, along with many other firms, were involved in the response, both immediate and the rebuild program. And I was in Christchurch, not immediately, but a month or two into that process, with some of their teams there, and we mobilised both local and international resources for that. And part of that was initially assessment of red zones, and they were areas that needed investigation as to whether they were actually feasible to rebuild, either as a result of that liquefaction or ongoing rock slide risk that was underway. And we mobilised a team, of many young engineers, a lot with geotech backgrounds and geology backgrounds, to investigate and document some of those risks in that piece. And the team we had there had noted that not only had some of these suburbs subsided, but a number of them that were along the Avon River were at flood risk, particularly as they, I think they were all surfers, but they realised that there was a king tide coming. And the king tide and the high water mark meant that not only some of these suburbs that had literally subsided vertically and houses, buildings and services in those suburbs were still intact, but they thought, well, what can we do? And there was a lot of earth-moving equipment being mobilised to clear roads and paths, and they immediately, really without much questioning of others, mobilised to build a number of levee banks along the Avon River. And what that really did was they showed the initiative to see a bigger problem that wasn't part of their defined brief, mobilise resources and probably beg for forgiveness later on if it was a wrong decision. And because there was a limited time frame, there was hours, not days, to have these levees built, mobilise that team, and that protected a number of suburbs and some critical infrastructure from further damage. And and that one stuck with me because we had a bunch of engineers who'd come from Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, and elsewhere, who just decided we need to take some action and get on with it. This is the right thing to do from an engineering sense, from a moral sense, to protect the community. And so it's a great piece of insight of those staff to take action. And you often see that when there is a critical shortage of resources, people you come back to the training, you come back to the initiation. It's a bit like the adage of a sporting team is how you play is how you train. So I think it's cemented in my mind that we need to give some delegation, some room to move to our younger professionals. We need to let them stretch themselves, and it's that piece of not allowing younger professionals to make disastrous mistakes, but really allow them to be bold enough to make some calls along the way. That's how I've learned, and it comes back in that sense that I found myself in my career as a 26-year-old and the only qualified engineer in the water department in Vanuatu, and answering to the head of department and through to the minister. And so there were lots of areas there where I was probably stretched by experience, only 5 years out of university. But I was ultimately, running the budgets, doing the designs, making the calls. And that's where reliance on others, that's where backing your own judgment, and just testing, of those decisions, and constantly evolving and learning. And I think that's an important part for our profession, particularly when we're very much reliant on technology and known solutions and very safe decision making. So I think we just need to challenge ourselves across all organisations where engineers work to promote that thinking and that stretch.
So we're talking about practical solutions. Got a great question coming from James Bunn. I'll just read it verbatim. I heard that GHD worked to help the post-Brexit freight logistics logjams at the beginning of the year. James says he witnessed 50-kilometre tailbacks at the Romanian-Bulgarian Danube crossing 2 weeks ago. Given that McDonald's in the UK press this week are complaining they can't get sugar for milkshakes, and there are also chicken shortages at Nando's due to driver skills shortage, is there a simple solution to this problem, e.g. move freight onto the rail network?
Well, I might pass on to Matt, because Matt's been much more involved with that across supporting the thinking with UK government and elsewhere. So it might be a best solution to introduce Matt to the audience here.
Certainly,
perfect, Matt. That's a question for you. And given you've got limited McDonald's and Nando's availability, that might be something you're not happy about.
yeah, it's surprising how quickly we start getting to the media once Nando's is not available to us going through our process. But it's predominantly, well, there's been a few reasons as to what's going through there, but the solutions, there are quick fire solutions that we can start looking at around moving freight to rail and leveraging the rail network to support our distribution patterns as we're going through that. But at the same time, we need to be thinking a bit further in the long term as to what are the overall solutions that's coming through. The main drivers here in the UK particularly is that as we've shifted away from the EU transition, we're losing EU drivers, we're losing that actual skills availability to us. So the government itself is starting to think about employment opportunities around the whole industry, but also how do we actually start creating the right infrastructure in the right locations to maximize the availability and effectiveness of our logistics network. So whilst we have a decent rail system in place, we might not have the right intermodal facilities located throughout the country to help that distribution pattern. We don't quite leverage that effectiveness as we're going through that. So what we did at the start of the year is we took a lot of mobility data to actually understand the behaviours and the directions that freight takes across the UK and start actually linking events together. And that gave us greater insight, which we can now tie back to logistics models that have been in play for about 60 odd years. But we can remove some of those assumptions and those ideas that we had previously about it, put a bit more evidence behind it, and actually start evolving plans that not only look at the short-term resolutions, but also put us in a position that we can react in the long term and actually start implementing those policies and strategies and feeding that down throughout the industry as we're going through that.
Now, another thing I know you talk a lot about, and it's an area close to my heart, is space. What is the future of space in the UK, and what's been your involvement to date?
So space has been a relatively newcomer to the UK environment going through that, but basically we're starting to see an uptake in terms of the number of industries actually looking towards space itself, the cost of actually getting up into the atmosphere and putting satellites and so forth up there is starting to reduce, and the value of doing so is starting to increase. So we're starting to see that we can capture more information, we can send more information going through that. From a perspective of the UK, what we're looking at, and we're focusing our sort of support from our international gateways experience, which has been developed over quite a fair amount of time going through that. It's looking at the industry itself and the primary assets, which for the UK platforms is basically just a concrete platform to launch vertically or a runway to launch horizontally. But then what are the secondary industries that are needed to support that actual operation going through that? We need manufacturing, education, and all those elements that come along with that. So to support that, it's basically utilizing the interdisciplinary nature of GHD and the experience that we have across that to actually bring together master planning, educational skills, actual manufacturing activities, and starting to see how we can develop those precincts, which then over time will actually sort of reinforce that capability as we're moving forward into that and provide the UK the ability to have a functioning space industry that not only looks at what's happening up in the sky, but also what's actually happening down the ground and how do we actually support that whole process.
Back to you, Richard. A question about, and maybe Matt, you can jump in as well, around skill shortages. Given all press around skill shortage, we touched on that before. Do firms need to expand their recruitment net outside the 25 to 35-year-old band to include experienced talent, older plus, 35 plus workers who are over experienced, and I'm probably in that band as well, that have valuable skills and can mentor? What about those experienced engineers? Can we find roles for them, and should we be recruiting them at sort of senior higher levels?
Well, I'll jump in first, but I think absolutely. Sort of when we think about diversity in our business, it's not just about gender, it's not about race, language, origins, and such like. Age and experience is part of that. And as I mentioned earlier, I think that there are great opportunities for those multi-generational teams to learn and challenge, and it's learning on all fronts. I think back, it was a few years ago where you typically think of mentoring as a more experienced person helping develop the career or sponsor the career in some cases of younger staff. And I reached out to our graduate program a few years ago and said, I'd like a mentor, thanks. And
Oh, wow. Okay.
and they looked at me, a little bit sideways. And because I realized I was coming at problem solving, I was coming at communications, I was coming at looking at solving challenges from not only a white Anglo-Saxon military trained engineer, but also somebody who was about 50. I got myself a 25-year-old mentor. And so we used to catch up and bounce ideas around. And it helped me think about that cross-generational piece of even problem solving. Corporately, you might be busy thinking about how am I going to communicate this in an all-staff bulletin, if you like. But as soon as someone gets a sniff, it's out there on social media apps. So, the whole timing of how things operate, of what's important, of what's valued, does change generationally. And, if we're coming up with solutions for a business, for infrastructure, for a government, it has to meet those challenges of the communities that benefit from it. And therefore, I think having those cross-discipline and cross-age group teams is really important. I think we need to think about our unconscious biases as organizations when we recruit. There's that great story about an orchestra who couldn't find any, senior musicians, and they used to have, people rock up and do their audition. And so straight away they knew the gender. So then they thought about having them do it blind behind a curtain, for a bit like the blind auditions. But then they realised that they could tell by the sound of the shoes walking on stage. So they ended up having people come on board and audition barefoot blind.
Yes, I have actually asked for mentors on multiple occasions, and similar to Richard, I've asked for mentors from a more senior position and also from a more junior position, even though my experience. Even though my experience is probably a fair bit less than what Richard's is, there's still that sort of generational gap to go back down to sort of understand how technology and social media is influencing us. So having that junior sort of respectiveness coming into that, The other aspect for myself, and something that's actually helped my career growth and understanding, has always been actually getting somebody who's had that senior experience, who's had that operational experience and that practicality. There have been situations where solutions have worked on paper, but when you actually run that past somebody who's actually had that practical experience, they bring out complexities that could be due to actual behaviors to do with the operations and so forth, that mean that that actual option isn't going to physically work or has some drawbacks associated to that. So having that senior sort of mentor and capability, and also just having those people with that wealth of knowledge and teasing that out of them is always a good piece to sort of test to see how it goes. And I guess it's a good example of, just even when you're looking at any project from your own personal perspective, you have that bias of actually seeing your own experience applied to it, reaching out to others with inside the industry and actually sort of leveraging the experience of the broader consortium means that you can actually start to pick up on where it is that you can bring in these efficiencies and optimization that you may not have thought about, or the complexities that may not have passed your mind in terms of how you've actually looked at the problem that you're facing, and you're trying to actually provide that advisory service back.
Richard, we lost you there for a bit,
I,
but because we're engineers, we have redundancy, so we jumped into Matt. But do you just want to finish what you were talking about there?
I was just talking about that bias and those unconscious areas, and Matt's jumped on and filled the space beautifully, talking about the bias of our own experience. And I go back to a much younger self, and I'll use that example back when I was over in Vanuatu for a couple of years. That there'd been an external role on a 2 to 3 year rotational cycle of an Australian or international engineer running this process for many years. And the project successes were always the same, and the project failures or difficulties were always the same. And I wanted to sort of leave a different legacy on that journey, have a different handover, so there was much more self-sufficiency from the local staff on my absence or on my leaving when I arrived. But I also really didn't understand the culture and the dynamics of this country, where English was a third or fourth language for most of the people. Because I was already having to design in French from the condominium government, because it was a French-run department, prior to independence. And so I found myself enrolling in an anthropology degree, learning about Melanesian culture and how we approached the whole formation of what was adequate, what was sufficient, what was the training required, what were the gender roles within successful projects and communities, and how that changed between the different language groups across the archipelago. And that saw over that time, things like the first technically trained women, on courses run in this plate of water, sanitation, plumbing, and otherwise in these areas. So I really think, we always need to stand back and think about what biases are we bringing to these wicked problems. How can that lead to greater project, program, or delivery success? And what skills don't I have? Because there's that old adage about, the more I learn, the less I really know. And so I think is that bringing that piece together, which comes back to the diversity of your skill sets, and age is one of those. So I really think that flexibility, and it's changing with the times, because what is a fad one year, or I go back to thinking about the changing energy and sustainability cycle. I've seen that completely change in my career, Andrew. One of the first jobs I did on leaving the military and joining GHD, I was very privileged to become the design manager on what was then the largest engineering-based project in Australia, turning the Port of Newcastle into the world's largest coal export terminal. And in the early 90s, that was the project to be part of. And when I think about what that means now, we're working with the Port of Newcastle to diversify their mix so they can meet the sustainability requirements of finance. And GHD is very much involved in designing, building, and funding a large hydrogen export terminal to export hydrogen from Australia. And so that's a complete shift in the dynamics of the energy sector over 30 plus years. And so I think, how these things move, what that means is that, training, development, education, the nature of our teams, the skills required will change. And that either means a lot more ongoing education and training and experiences for all of us in our careers, as well as being prepared to have challenges to the nature of what makes up a successful project team.
I want to ask you about the way that engineers can adapt, and it's interesting you went from coal to gas, but I can't leave the section about you asking for a mentor. What was the one thing that surprised you that your mentor taught you?
That's a question that probably I haven't considered in a one thing, but I think it was really that it was really the wealth of knowledge and the wealth of value that comes from our much younger staff. And like all of us, they're willing to share, but how often do senior leaders ask? And so I've reflected on that and applied that. There's a project we're running in Abu Dhabi, helping to create a new government department and entity in the policy regarding trade facilitation and logistics improvements in the UAE. And I can remember we went in to present the findings and the path forward to the Supreme Council of Government in Abu Dhabi, and I was there, as was our leader of our UK Middle Eastern practice. The key speaking parts, one of them was a less than 2-year graduate female. And at first she had the shock of horrors when we said, we want you to come along and do the speaking part. But strangely enough, Abu Dhabi is very progressive, and there are a number of CEOs and members of that committee who were female, who really applauded the fact that it wasn't grey-haired men, but we had a range of people of experiences who were delivering that presentation, and she excelled. So, but it's a great experience. Now, I remember that, and hopefully she will for the rest of her life. It really gave her a real chance to back herself and realise that we all add a lot of value at all levels. And so, for me, it's always about asking, and I'm never disappointed by the quality of our graduates and the inputs they bring.
I'm challenged by this a lot of times with clients as well about how do we bring the two groups together. And if you can think of a word picture, there are two tribes. There's the going digital and the born digital. And I think the two groups have so much to learn from each other, and you need to bring them together. And one way is asking for a younger, emerging leader type mentor. But I think if you consider the tribes in your organization, and you will think differently. You mentioned before about TikTok. So your aspiring leaders are all over that, and they'll have a different view about how to source information, communicate. So I would encourage everyone on the call here, think about those two tribes and how do you bring them together? Is it in a mentor environment? Do you run a hackathon? I encourage clients to run a hackathon, even though you might think that's for tech companies. It allows the young leaders to shine. They have a voice. It also allows the going digital, and with respect, Richard, you're probably a going digital more than a born digital. It allows you to hear the way they think. So I think regardless of the discipline or the industry, that can be really, really powerful. I've got about 6 minutes left on the webinar, so I want to get through a couple more things. We can't talk about engineering and progressive without springing forward from the pandemic, which is the whole reason d'etre that we've done this. Engineers are all about designing solutions to the world's problems, and arguably for the last 18 or 20 months, we've all been living through massive change. I know, Richard, you're all locked down in Sydney as we speak. How do you believe engineers are positioned for new opportunities driven by the pandemic?
If we just cast our mind back, before we go forward, and I think we can all learn from history, is just about every societal change or major piece of changing infrastructure or pivots in history have involved outcomes that engineers have had a fair hand in. So whether it be space that Matt's spoken about, and travel and communications, whether it be as simple as water and sanitation that took place in London, sort of 300-400 years ago, and everything in between. So I think we've got to realise we need to be there first, and we need to bring those ideas together. And there's a role that we, as a leadership role, that we have to take as a profession, rather than waiting for someone to fill in that space. Secondly, I think that the whole idea about how supply chains regarding the provision of infrastructure, goods and services can be optimized is requiring science-based solutions, and engineering is an applied science. So I think there's a piece there that we have a fair hand in understanding how that is undertaken, and having a voice. So for me, the challenge for us is to extend that voice and have that voice as a profession. So there's a role there for organisations like Engineers Australia. There's a role there for individuals, member groups and companies, to be there to have that voice and not wait necessarily to be asked. Like we find in the consulting piece, that there's often companies who don't know the challenges that they're going to face next week, next year, until it comes up. So I think, we need to be proactive and not reactive would be my piece of taking that forward. I know it's a very broad answer, but it's not, but we've got to start with the broad challenge and solutions, and it can hone back into a detailed technical brief, a bit later on. But Matt, you want to contribute to that as well?
Yeah. From my perspective, I think, and probably throwing a bit of optimism against it, the pandemic has more or less just accelerated previous behaviors and sort of evolutions as we're going through that. And engineers before the pandemic were positioned to answer those. It's, as Richard said, it's basically just making sure that we have a voice and we are positioned on how we can sort of help going through those. But a good example of how that evolution and acceleration has occurred, e-commerce. We were starting to see greater uptake of people getting deliveries to their doors, using Amazon to actually get purchasing products, actually going to shops, trying clothes on, but going back and buying it off the websites and so forth. What we've seen in the pandemic is just that people are starting to actually uptake that behavior at a faster rate than what we had previously anticipated. And it's coming to grasp with what has been those changes and just repositioning our founding thinking to actually sort of go, right, where do we sit in terms of this and how do we actually evolve ourselves to going through that process? So I think just being aware of what our capabilities and what the offerings were before, seeing how that's changed slightly, and then just repositioning again and continuing that same level of effort.
I think, Andrew, it's just
Almost
fast
had
track some of the removal of those biases, let's say. There's been biases about having to be in the same room to meet, or we've all hopped on planes and travelled. And if you take the removal of those biases and the ESG thinking, it's probably fast tracked us by 5 to 10 years on some of those topics.
Question for both of you as we bring this webinar to a close. I want to look at your view on the future of engineering. Big question. Will we see more engineers doing double degrees? And how do we encourage primary and tertiary students to consider an engineering degree? Maybe you first, Matt, because you're probably closer to have done that.
Well, I didn't actually go through a double degree myself, but I think we are going to be seeing a lot more engineers going out and acquiring double degrees. We're seeing a lot more uptake in terms of business degrees in line with the engineering degrees, environmental in line with your engineering degrees, and so forth. So I think that broader knowledge base and understanding of elements that sit outside of the engineering practice is coming quite valuable in terms of how we're going through that process. How do we actually attract more people to the engineering practice? I think that starts back at primary school, to be honest. And it's about instigating that idea that engineering is not just doing the calculations, the paperwork, and being out on site. There is a much broader aspect associated to that, and actually encouraging those at a younger age and saying that there's actually quite a significant opportunity associated to the engineering practice that we can actually start to build upon.
And just looking at the time, I'll just add in, I know we're on schedule here, but I think there's two things. I think double degrees, yes, but I think it'd be much more micro-credentialing and gaining new skills in short courses that might build to something over time along the journey. Secondly, I think that they'll have to see a pivot. We've seen some of that online learning pivot over the last couple of years. I've got a daughter who's had very few days at university in the last 2 years, and most has been online. I think with the attraction, I think we need to build the understanding that, we currently have a lot of primary school teachers that STEM is not their forte. So there has to be the encouragement of STEM being part of why you want to teach rather than you teach it because it's part of the syllabus. I know I was, in my daughter's schools in that primary school going along and doing a day in the life of type, teaching year fives to build bridges and design bridges and these sorts of things. But I've seen something this year that's been great that in New South Wales, schools infrastructure through a school board I'm involved in redeveloping a school campus. Part of what the requirement is, the architects, engineers, and contractors have to have a STEM in the schools program as part of their tender offer. So they have to integrate with these high school students to show the career pathways, and has led to a large number of those on site and involved in from the delivery side being younger women. So it's the role modeling piece. And I think there's a walk and talk piece we've got to have there so people can sort of see that these are exciting careers and that's something that match with what younger women want and can do. So I think there's a number of pieces there, but it does require the industry to think a little bit further out about cultural change for some of these areas.
We could talk for hours on this, and I hope we do again in the future, but we're out of time. Maybe I'll ask that to Matt. How can people find out more about you and in touch with each of you?
They can reach out to the GHD website, our LinkedIn profiles as well, but they can more than welcome to email us and have a quick chat. For those based in the UK around the London area, I'm more than happy to meet up at a coffee shop and even have a chat over a nice cup of coffee or a beer later in the afternoon just going through that. So just reach out and we're good to have a good chat with you.
And Richard, are you open to people contacting you? Is there a good way to get in touch with you and learn about what you're doing?
Absolutely, the same thing either via the GHD website or my profile's there on LinkedIn. There aren't too many people with my name, so you'll find me that way.
Thank you both so much for your time, and thanks everyone for attending today. A really great list of attendees on the call today. You can find out more about the upcoming series on the Engineering Australia website, and if you've got some suggestions for upcoming guests, please let us know. But stay safe. Thank you very much for learning today, and goodbye for now.